universal principles, import them into Canadian law, freedom of religion, equality, and law, etc. No, that's not true. It is freedom from having to follow the will of your Creator and defining your own will and having the freedom and therefore liberty as a people to do what you want to do and act as your own Elohim or God. That's what's being addressed. It's remarkable how many points these scholars and all miss. But I guess if your mind is confused, then that's the way it is. But anyway, I'll just finish this shortly, and then anybody can comment on it. But it just was a very, very interesting document from my point of view, from what I'm in the middle of addressing right now. Okay, by pointing to certain universal freedoms which positive law is required to protect, the Charter, intentionally or unwittingly, draws on the sources which lie outside the positive law. Part of the task which the Canadian courts must undertake when interpreting the content of those universal freedoms is to explore and understand the principles which flow from those other sources. Theology and philosophy are those other sources. Faith and reason are the methods by which their principles are discerned. Looked at this way, the supremacy of God and the rule of law are principles on which Canada is founded, and the preamble demarks the point in which courts must depart from their efforts to interpret and apply the general principles of the Charter to the particular acts of Canadian governments. The preamble challenges the courts to engage in the political necessity and analysis of the relationship between transcendental and the temporal in the democratic life. The supremacy of God, in other words, is what infuses the Charter's provisions, its supreme laws, with a claim to social justice and a foundation of a moral legitimacy. It is from these aspirational quality Charter's interpretations I would suggest that the primacy of human dignity derives. This connection is not unknown to Charter jurisprudence. For example, in R versus Bear, the human dignity was parsed with the recourse to the human supremacy of God in the Charter and Bill of Rights, the earlier Bill of Rights. It would be incongruous if a Charter which expressly recognizes the supremacy of God in the preamble and implied no less than the Bill of Rights 1970, Appendix 3, the dignity and worth of the human person were to shield the person from the loss of a finger, but not from the loss of his self-respect. I note that the inherent dignity of a person has at least two aspects. First, that the threshold level of dignity and worth which defines humanness and which is the birthright of every individual, regardless of societal perceptions of human worth and regardless of individual perceptions of self-worth. Second, that the dignity and self-worth that the individual derives from his own sense of self-respect. Of course, such a judicial experimentation with possible meaning of the preamble would have been the exception, not the rule. To return to the problem posed at the outset, how would the court's elaboration of human dignity as a constitutional norm differ if it were deeply rooted in the supremacy of God as the normative framework? One thing, I believe the dignity would no longer be understood solely as an individual autonomy, but as a social interdependency. This is what you have in the Constitution of the former Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and we have in all of our national laws today that are put in place from the will of the people. Every Western nation is communist in its legislation. Every single of the 10 articles is in place in Western national law, Canada and America included. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about some of these things later. You know, we've already been undermined. We'll come to the point where we will all have to acquiesce to the United Nations Constitution. It will govern individual nations, and individual nations will be removed. There'll be a global government and a global law, and it is not going to end very well with that. Okay, one should not readily accept that the right to life in Section 7 means nothing. To begin with, this violates the basic standards of interpretation by suggesting that the Charter speaks essentially in vain in respect to this fundamental right. More importantly, however, it threatens to undermine the coherence and purpose of the Charter as a whole. After all, the right to life is a prerequisite for the very possibility of enjoying all other rights guaranteed by the Charter. Well, only God can guarantee anything, and especially rights which He granted. To say that this is not to set up a hierarchy of Charter rights, no doubt a meaningful right to life is reciprocally conditioned by these other rights. They guarantee that human life has dignity, worth, and meaning. Nevertheless, the centrality of the right to life in the Charter as being whole is obvious. Indeed, it would be anomalous if, while guaranteeing a complex of rights and freedoms deemed or thought to be necessary to human fulfillment within society, the Charter has nothing of significance to say about the right that is indispensable for the enjoyment of all these others. So you will be taxed and you will pay for everybody's things that they're doing, and you cannot live and function alone according to these tenets, which is, I forget which article that is of the articles of communism. All of this fits perfectly with that. It's just been spoon-fed to us in a way that we've been conned and eaten into it. So, if the applicant is exposed to the full 3-month suspension for her benefits, I have to back up, I missed a paragraph here. As a further and related example of this different approach to human dignity, consider the case of Kimberly Rogers, the Ontario welfare recipient who, while in her 3rd trimester of pregnancy, was sentenced to house arrest for fraud because she had received government loans, failed to disclose these amounts to the welfare authorities. Rogers' case gained notoriety because she died while confined to her apartment of an apparent overdose of medications. Rogers succeeded in obtaining a constitutional exemption from the effect of a ban on receiving welfare, which would have left her confined to an apartment with no source of income whatsoever. In granting this exception, Epstein offered the following rationale based on a societal or social notion of human dignity. If the applicant is exposed to the full 3-month suspension of her benefits, a member of our community carrying the unborn child may be homeless and deprived of basic sustenance. Such a situation would jeopardize the health of Ms. Rogers and the fetus, thereby adversely affecting not only the mother and child but also the public, its dignity. So here we have an unborn child with a potential future dignity, but all the tens of millions of aborted fetuses every year are just a piece of flesh that can be removed and then used for health and that other things. It's human rights, it's health care resources. For many reasons, there is overwhelming public interest in protecting the pregnant woman in our community from being destitute. The implications of this approach to human dignity are far-reaching. If our collective dignity is undermined by members of our community being deprived of basic sustenance by the failure of the state to provide sufficient support through welfare benefits, then the Charter may require the state proactive obligations to care for its most vulnerable citizens. What could justify this judicial intrusion into the sovereignty of Parliament to decide how it wishes to allocate money? The answer, surely, cannot be the rule of law, which restrains government action rather than compelling it. In my view, the supremacy of God provides a basis for subsuming the will of Parliament, that is, the will of the people, who exert their own will instead of the will of God, higher constitutional obligations of the kind Epstein alludes to in Rogers and Arbor, and emphasizes in Gosselin, while recourse to the preamble and the supremacy of God is not necessary to achieve this interpretation of Section 7, or to the Charter generally.